Gregor model is one of those guys who doesn't need a special presentation here because he's a spiritus movens of many conferences here, of Aufhebung. He's very well known as the philosopher who wrote an excellent book on Hegel and Spinoza, and he writes now on comedy. I think your book is already published in English.
On comedy?
Yeah.
No.
Not yet, okay. So, sorry, Gregor, the floor is yours.
Peter, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I really loved how you started it, like Gregor really needs no introduction, as if everyone knows me, which is of course ridiculous, because, you know, I mean, personally, yes, maybe, but like, who am I? Who am I to be known? So, yeah. Thank you for the wild discussion and this talk, Helen. I thought I'm going to talk about a completely different topic, but nevertheless, I did notice some similarities. Maybe we'll be able to go into that. So this presentation is called Authenticity or Alienation. No, thank you. It's quite a big promise, I think, in the time, so we'll see if I'm going to be able to deliver. It's part of an ongoing project dedicated to the history and legacy of Yugoslav social philosophy between 1960 and 1990. So nothing sexy, nothing particularly, you know, invigorating or whatever. And this project is not designed as an exhaustive project, as a panoramic overview of the entire history of social thought in Yugoslavia. Instead, it focuses on a handful of key concepts within two major philosophical streams. The first stream gravitated around the journal Praxis and Korčula Summer School, and we can roughly say that its main activity was between the years of 1960 and 1974. And we could describe the second stream as the prehistory of what gradually became known informally as the Ljubljana School, so prehistory of that. Its most defining period being that of the 1980s. Now, it's important to note that neither of these streams are clearly defined and that the institutional foundations also varied. In other words, these are mainly just streams. These are, you know, just basic coordinates of what I want to talk about. Now, one of the ideas that marks a clear distinction between these two streams, between Praxis and Ljubljana, was precisely the idea of alienation, as described by Marx in his Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, but first published in 1932. Alienation was one of the central problems of the Praxis stream, especially the alienation present in an existing socialist state of Yugoslavia. Now, this might strike an unfamiliar reader, you know, someone who is unfamiliar with the historical context of Yugoslavia's third-way socialism as odd, because in the manuscripts, Marx uses general humanist terms to provide an almost existentialist analysis of human alienation in the world of capitalist production. So how is it then that Yugoslav critical philosophers would pick up this topic in the 1960s as something that pertains precisely to the socialist economic regime, and not simply to criticize capitalism? So Gajo Petrović, who was one of the founders of the Praxis journal, describes the orientation of the group in very programmatic editorial in the following way. So I'll read from Gajo Petrović, a very interesting figure in the history of Yugoslav philosophy. He writes, "The development of an authentic," I underline this word obviously, "the development of an authentic humanist socialism is impossible without a renewal and a development of Marx's philosophical thought." End of quote. So this is from the text called Why Praxis, declaring the purposes of establishing this new journal, and it is very candid about its scopes and intentions, its concerns and presuppositions. First, by arguing that what is desired is an authentic and humanist socialism, they are making the claim, at least Petrović is, that the existing reality of Yugoslav socialism, well, was neither authentic or humanist. And second, by focusing on Marx's philosophy rather than on Marx's science, and speaking about a renewal and a development of that philosophy, they are also making quite clear that it is actually the philosophical thought that must be nurtured and practiced in order to properly develop the political regime of authentic socialism. This was an orientation explicitly diverging from the Soviet Marxism, from even like Petrovich even explicitly criticizes Lenin's materialism and empiric criticism. But of course, above all, it was a clear divergence from Todor Pavlov's theory of reflection. So these are really boring. I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of these people. These are really kind of classics. Nadezhda, of course, has heard of these people. So let's say that Todor Pavlov and, well, I'm not going to go into that. Anyway, the Praxis philosophers really wanted to distance themselves from this kind of Soviet Marxism. Let me read some lines from the next paragraph from this opening editorial, where these points are even clearer. So this is still Petrovich. The contemporary world is still a world of economic exploitation, national inequalities, political infreedom, spiritual emptiness. That's, you can say that probably in any period of human history. The more important things follow. The greater and greater achievements of man in creation of means of subjugation of nature are more and more successfully transforming him, namely man, into a supplementary instrument of his instruments, which is kind of an interesting phrase. And the pressure of mass impersonalism and of the scientific method of cultivation of the masses is more and more opposed to the development of a free human personality. End of quote. So the terminology and the selected topics, I think, are extremely revealing here. The idea that humans have successfully become instruments of their own instruments, slaves to the very processes that made them masters over nature, this is a very felicitous phrasing, I think, and I suppose it's universally true. Who hasn't realized at some point or another that the appliances that modern technology has equipped us with may have been indeed created to serve us in our endeavors. They supposedly save us a lot of time, but they have also proven to become an enormous waste of time and energy, considering how much effort we spend in thinking about them and making sure that they are properly fed and that they have all the energy they need and that they're updated and so on. How nervous we are when they aren't, or where there's no connection and so on. So this seems very obviously true, that we have clearly become instruments of our instruments. Although I'll come back to this specific term later on. In this quote from Petrovich, we can also register the binary opposition between what he calls a free human personality, on the one hand, and mass impersonalism. Impersonalism, of course, again, refers to the suffocating bureaucracy, especially typical of Stalinism, which was a favorite target of Praxis philosophers. The critique of the Soviet Marxism was an obvious point of convergence between the group and the official position of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. This is what they had in common. The official Yugoslav party and the Praxis groups, they all hated Stalin. I mean, this was basically, this was the only thing they had in common. But it seems telling that the obstacle to authentic socialism, as Petrovich calls it, was described with reference to the scientific method. The question of whether Marxism is a philosophy or science was a decisive one. But in reality, Praxis was just as critical of the Yugoslav political economic system. Zagorka Golubovic, one of the Belgrade-based Praxis philosophers, points out, again, probably never heard of her, but except Nadezhda and of course others. There are people who know who I'm talking about. So she points out quite clearly that the official party critique of Stalinism remained only external. This is what Zagorka Golubovic criticized the party for, Yugoslav party. Since the Yugoslav party didn't turn this critique of Soviet Marxism onto what she calls Stalinism in its own ranks. and onto its own procedures. And that, Golubovich underlines, was precisely the task of Praxis. So to criticize the Stalinism of the very Yugoslav party, which was officially opposed to Stalinism, but still kind of, tacitly used its methods. That's the idea. So the motto of the group, quote unquote, to relentlessly critique all existing reality, obviously included the existing reality in Yugoslavia, and the party authorities were very well aware of that. Now, coming back to the editorial by Petrović, we can clearly sense in the quote the specific influence of the thinker of authenticity. I think even if you think of the term instrument, I'm sure that the Heidegger text on Technik is very clearly there, because that specific text is on the concept of the instrument, from beginning to the end. And Petrović indeed, in his own contribution, like a full paper to this first issue of Praxis, he actually does heavily quote Heidegger. He even connects Marx's idea of authentic socialism with Heidegger. This is a very interesting point that I think was true for a lot of Praxis philosophers. So Petrović suggests, in very openly Heideggerian terms, that the most authentic mode of existence, quote unquote, is precisely what he calls practice. So he's using Heideggerian terminology to describe what he feels to be authentic socialism. Now, the problem of Heidegger's concept of authenticity, or better, Eigentlichkeit, is a very complicated matter, I think. For the purpose of this presentation, I will only sketch a widespread interpretation shared by Petrović, where this term, authenticity, indicates a form of existentialist philosophy and ultimately a form of humanism. According to this interpretation, one must follow the injunction to be who you are and turn away from the everyday life of habit, from the mundane occupations, and return to the forgotten question of one's own being. And only in this return to ourselves can our existence be authentic. Now, the problem of this interpretation, and especially the problem of how Petrović links authenticity to a living practice, is that this interpretation assumes that there is such a thing as an authentic human practice. That this is something that is possible within Heideggerian framework. In this sense, I think it is also quite revealing that, when Petrović translated his own text into German, he did not use Heidegger's own term Eigentlichkeit, but rather the term Authentizität, which is already, I think, quite indicative of changing the actual meaning of the word. But Praxis philosophers in general, not just Gaja Petrović, accepted the notion that the Marxist concept of alienated labor, as described in the manuscripts of 1844, could be adequately addressed by suggesting an authentic, creative living practice. This is the cornerstone of Praxis philosophy. So yes, we live in an alienated world, and we have to counter that with an authentic, creative living practice. Almost 60s, right? This has to have been the 60s, right? Now, in part, it seems that Heidegger himself offered some ground for the coupling of his philosophy with humanist Marxism when he briefly discussed Marx's concept of alienation or estrangement in what seem surprisingly approving terms. I'm talking about Heidegger now. So, comparing his own Heidegger's notion of radical human homelessness to Marx's and Hegel's concept of alienation. He does that in Letter on Humanism. But at the same time, so Heidegger writes something like, what Marx recognized in an essential and significant sense, though derived from Hegel, as the estrangement of the human being, has its roots in the homelessness of modern human beings. End of quote. This is from Heidegger. So he praises Marx, saying that but actually he borrowed it from Hegel. But nevertheless praises Marx's, estrangement. Yes, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about homelessness. But at the same time, Heidegger makes it very clear that homelessness is neither something that humans could cure, nor that such a cure would be even desirable. I just want to comment here on, on the question of universalism of alienation. Like, for Heidegger, I think this would be a non-question. Obviously, yes, we are universally heimlosig. This would potentially be a huge difference between Heidegger and Lacan, but we can discuss that later on. I think this is a very interesting question. Anyway, so there's no cure for Heimlosigkeit, or even the notion that such a cure would even be something that we could potentially desire. Heidegger understands it as the defining characteristic of humans. He calls it the existence. And furthermore adds that this has nothing to do with existentialism or humanism. It's Heidegger, but still, I mean, he does say that pretty clearly. It's not existentialism and it's not humanism. So in short, Heidegger was actually very rarely taken seriously on these 2 points. I mean, Heidegger was consistently read as an existentialist and humanist, even though I think he made it pretty clear that that's not what he's interested in. Okay. But these questions and endeavors of the Praxis group were taken very seriously by the Communist Party establishment of the time, as I've mentioned earlier. And rightfully so. Branislaw Jakovlevich, author of Alienation Effects, a current professor at Stanford, argues that the success of the Praxis group, including the international recognition it gained through its yearly held Korčula Summer School, and especially the fact that the critique of the bureaucratized system of self-management in Yugoslavia resonated so well with the sentiment not only among the intellectuals, but among the population in general, that all this contributed to the widespread student protests in Belgrade in June 1968. In June 1968, so just a month after the protests in Paris. So while the party establishment tolerated Praxis philosophy to some extent, the differences between their respective concepts of self-management were ultimately unreconcilable. Edvard Kardel, who again you've never heard of, Edvard Kardel, but he was the second in the official party structure only to Tito. Like, he was not a random guy. He was like kind of the underboss. Sorry, there's a statue. Yeah. We can look at the statue of Kardel. There's still a little bit of a statue to Kardel here on the Revolution Square. It's still called the Revolution Square. So anyway, Edvard Kardel, who was the mastermind behind the idea of self-management as a distinct economic principle in Yugoslavia, distinct from Soviet-style economy. Kardel eventually spent a great deal of effort debunking the Praxis group, taking their concepts and their critiques very, very seriously. I mean, he went beyond what you would expect of a party official, way beyond. Kardel depicted them as unrealistic, ultra-leftist band of intellectuals, decrying them at the same time as anarchists and as Stalinists, and leveled some baseless critique at them, like really baseless critique. But also at the same time, as Gal Kirn suggests, a colleague of ours, I think a lot of us know him personally, a contemporary professor, as Gal Kirn suggests, Kardel actually took criticism of the Praxis group seriously enough to ultimately absorb its position in his own concept of self-management. This is what Gal Kirn suggests, and we don't have to, I'm sure not everyone will agree with that, but this is what he suggests, and I don't think it's completely unsubstantiated. One of the most famous declarations about self-management that Kardel uttered in 1978 thus begins with the following words of wisdom. Let me read from Edvard Kardel. You have to realize that this is a bit funny for a Slovenian to read Kardel kind of seriously. All right. So, but he says this, and it's kind of wise. Kardel says this: happiness cannot be brought to man by the state, nor by the system, nor by a political party. I mean, the state cannot give you happiness.
But that's part of the party program. It's official.
We'll come to that. Man alone can create happiness for himself. End of quote. Now, since Edvard Kardel was one of the main authors of the constitution of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, I thought it might be interesting, but also funny for our non-Yugoslavian friends, to compare his words to those of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson writes, "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only object of a good government." Right? So, I mean, Kardel tells us quite clearly, look, don't expect that we'll make you happy. And Jefferson tells us, no, that's the only reason why government exists. You've got to be happy. I mean, it's... pick your side. The difference couldn't be more pronounced. And as a quick orientation point, the insistence on authenticity of human life and creativity within an organized state is what makes Praxis' position closer to Jefferson. I'm using this only to, making a caricature, just for people who are unfamiliar with this Yugoslavian people, to have a little bit of... So Praxis, Jefferson. The state is there to make you happy. And Kardel, on the other hand, could be seen as someone like Churchill, who said, what did he say? Oh, democracy, it's terrible. What did he say exactly? Let me read.
It's better than all the other forms. It's the worst form of government, but it's better than
except for all the others that have been tried. Yes. All right. Thank you, Brits. So Kardel and Churchill, I think, have a kind of like they're on the other side. So Jefferson and Praxis on the one side, and Kardel and Churchill on the other side. Like the cynical, sorry Brits, the cynical perspective on the reality of the political system. Now, what is almost uncanny about the cynical wisdom of old Kardel, or old Churchill for that matter, is that in a sense they do have a point. Is it not somewhat naive to expect from the political system to care for your happiness? Should we not instead count happiness among the states that we could describe, following John Elster, as the states which are essentially byproducts? That is to say, we usually cannot simply decide that we will be happy. Happiness is most often an unexpected result of a felicitous encounter. It's not something that we can organize our society in order to produce that. But the problem with the state-secured happiness is even bigger on the level of the psyche. Is my individual unhappiness already a revolutionary act? Alternatively, am I even allowed to be unhappy or unsuccessful or depressed in a system that is organized around my happiness? Should I feel guilty about my discontent in such a system? The cynical wisdom of Kardel and Churchill can offer us great psychic relief in this regard. If the system is not there to make me happy or to even care about my happiness, this can empower me to simply play it. And it can indeed be a relief. In Yugoslavia, in practical terms, this was the solution to self-management. Nobody took it seriously, including the authorities. And playing the system were the actual words to live by. However, the point that I'm trying to make is not only that if the system does not care about me, I also don't have to care about the system. The interesting point on a deeper level, perhaps, is that if I accept that the system is indifferent to me, not only this allows me to be indifferent to the system, but it also allows me to be indifferent to my own self. What do I mean by this? A practical example could be our relationship to work. And if Marxist concept of alienation is at stake, then our relationship to work is perhaps certainly the paradigmatic example. If I don't think about my work in terms of a career that I'm building, but rather in terms of just a job that I do, This ultimately releases me not only from the pressure of performing well, but more importantly, it releases me from the immense pressure of having a responsibility to myself in the first place. I'm very happy that Laurent de Soete is taking part of this conference, because his book on the self, Pour en finir avec soi-même, How to Get Rid of Yourself, was a great inspiration for me in returning to the question of alienation. Now, authenticity is not the specific topic of de Soete's work, which focuses on self-care, self-discipline, self-love, and perhaps even self-management in a very literal meaning of the management of the self. Nevertheless, de Soete's main thrust could also be phrased, I think, in terms of authenticity. Our contemporary problem is not so much that we have lost the touch with our true self and have neglected it, but perhaps precisely the opposite. That we seem to be more and more surrounded, on the one hand, by bureaucratic processes that demand constant authentications, authorizations, identifications. But on the other hand, we are also surrounded by a plethora of practices and parapraxis where the bureaucratic demand for authenticity is replaced by perhaps an even more brutal demand, a demand for spiritual authenticity, where we not only have to demonstrate that we are indeed who we claim to be, but where we also have to really be that person that we have demonstrated to be. And I would even go as far as to say that it seems that it is precisely the operation of the distinction between what we could refer to in somewhat antiquated terminology as authentic and inauthentic selfhood that perpetuates this push for ever more authenticity. I think I'm just going to end it here in the sense of stop talking, because I know that this is absolutely not a conclusion, and you'll just have to apologize me for not bringing it to a meaningful finale. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Gregor. Questions?
No, I just have I'm not going to take time because people have questions. I really expected you to go on and to see the way the so-called latest Ljubljana school started by exactly criticizing this type of humanist philosophy. The first Zizek is there. You have it there.
Yeah, I do.
Just, well, at least mention it, because it's the second part of the story.
All right, so in the second part of the paper that I did not deliver, I go, no, it's true. No, it's completely right. The whole point is that the Ljubljana school completely avoided or even
so far that the first publications were had at least a semblance of a completely dogmatic Marxism. That's how
the praxis philosopher understood them, and this is why ultimately I think Althusser's position was really important, because Althusser. Okay, I'm gonna tell that then. So Althusser is the topic here. No. It was part of my talk. I just decided not to bore you with that. But like the praxis philosophers were really proud that at some point they did not publish a certain paper published by a certain French intellectual. And if we believe them, Milan Cankar, one of the founders, says that the text that they received to be published in their journal and they rejected was none other than Louis Althusser's text on ideology and ideological state apparatuses. That text was deemed by them, by a praxis philosopher, as pure Stalinism, which is very interesting, because the history of that text in Ljubljana is completely different. Like in Ljubljana, that text was the answer both to socialist self-management bureaucracy, as well as to too much humanism. It was a kind of a solution to the alternative between bureaucracy and authenticity.
You said it's not only one school, but a few of them.
Okay, before I pass further, is there a place in your story for Božidar Debenjak? Just a note to the public who doesn't know who Božidar Debenjak is. Božidar Debenjak is one of our professors. He published in 1970 a book on Marx and alienation, which is very influential. And at the time, with one foot, I think he was even at Korčula's summer school.
He was at school?
He wasn't part of the practice group, but he was there.
He was there, but he never had the paper.
Okay, that's very important because with the other foot, he was very anti-Heideggerian. He translated Adorno jargon der Eigentlichkeit, etc. And he's also one of the, let's say, uncles from the above, who somehow influenced some of the members of Ljubljana school, for instance, Mladen Dolara, Riha, and Slava is kind of different story. So.
Yes, his story is also extremely interesting here.
Because, you know, philosophy is a Kampfplatz, you know, as Kant said, and in Slovenia, Kampfplatz was, you know, between the official ideology, Marxism, then there was a praxis school, and Heideggerians. As
exactly. I mean, this is like, exactly. And it's interesting that for praxis, Heidegger and Marx were sort of seen as a couple. In Ljubljana, like, the Marxists were either not Marxists at all, but actually structuralists, which only later started taking Marx more seriously, or they were just Heideggerians, just that, and certainly not Marxists, which is a very different path.
Sorry for using power. I will just ask one more question, or maybe three. Gregor, first of all, I would like to ask you a very personal question. What is it with this either or in your titles, you know, Hegel or Spinoza, authenticity or alienation? Somehow you were in the vein of Makayevo in Hegel and Spinoza. Yes, please, coffee or tea, yes, please. Now you're saying, no, thank you. You're not saying no, thanks. You're saying, not thank you. It's very Althusserian topics as you were interpolated with something. So just a thought. And secondly, is there authentic practice for Heidegger? I think yes.
I think not.
Farming and philosophy, of course.
I think not.
I think not. Okay. Then you
Praxis, no subject.
Yeah. You emphasized Heimlosigkeit in Heidegger, but there's also a very well-known reference of Heidegger to Antigona, to human being as uncanny being, unheimliche Wesen.
That's from Einführung in die Metaphysik?
A couple of places, I think. So that would be a question. It slightly shifts the problematic in Heidegger, not that I'm defending him in a way. And I don't think that authentication as a bureaucratic procedure is the same as authenticity. So I think there's a slight difference here. So
okay, that's important.
Okay. I'll stop here.
So I'll just respond, I think, to the last question, because I think that's... you wanted me to say more? I don't know. I think this last question, you know, what's the relationship between bureaucracy and authentic selfhood? I think that's the question. Like, can my authenticity be expressed in bureaucratic actions? Can I authentically be the guy who looks at me in the passport? I mean, this is ultimately the question, which I think is also the question of, I mean, can I exist authentically in any sort of human system, which in the end will be bureaucratic in the sense that it will have certain forms, rituals, someone will press a stamp at you at some point. If not a literal stamp in your passport, then some other processes, and rituals that will include you or exclude you will happen. So I think this is the question that I think we are kind of addressing, basically, like, is there a political system which authentically expresses human being? And I would say that for the most people, I think, except perhaps for the Protestants, I'm sorry, Niklas, except perhaps for the Protestants, the obvious answer would be that probably no. We would probably spontaneously be on the Churchill side of the divide. We would probably say, of course, the system cannot bring you happiness. It's not there to bring you happiness. It's not there to care about you. But I think the question is nevertheless open. I think a lot of, I mean, because in a sense, and this is what I was going to talk about in the second part, because in a sense, the same sort of fallacy, a very similar sort of fallacy that you can make if you simply accept the logic of authenticity or the politics of authenticity, you can also make a very similar mistake if you simply accept this cynical wisdom that, oh, the system, you know, it's just the system, it has nothing to do with me, I'm beyond that. That's basically the beautiful soul perspective. I want to keep the system to be inauthentic in order, you know, to sustain my notion of being beyond it. So I think it's the same sort of fallacy. And this is how I come back to the either or. This is why I don't think that ultimately you can easily, you know, decide that, you know, alienation is better, authenticity is for hippies. I don't think it's that easy. I honestly believe that, you know, if you put it that way, you're making the very same mistake.
Just a final remark. The paper from Hegel, it's originally from 1974. So it's
Which
4 years. The paper where he's talking about happiness. It's from 1974. It's from his.
Oh, Cardell.
Yeah, it's the 7th Congress of the party here in Ljubljana.
Yeah.
Oh, from Cardell, sorry.
Yeah, so Cardell. And you should also invoke the French Revolution. You invoked American Revolution with Jefferson, but in the French Revolution, it's Saint Just who says happiness is a new idea in Europe. So it would complicate things a little. Okay, so I stop.
The real complicator is Locke, of course, but yes.
I've forgotten in all that what I put my hand up for. But it was something to do with the conclusion. I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit, because you said it wasn't a conclusion. It was actually quite a powerful point, I think, that you made from Laurent's book, and it seems to be absolutely the case that almost the tragedy of this next generation is that they're compelled to identify themselves, and then they have faced the almost lifelong task of, you know, whether that's to identify their gender, their sexuality, or something else. I mean, even thinking of those furries, you know, the people who identify as cat or whatever, you know, and then they actually, in some cases, this is an irrevocable decision. You have to spend the rest of your life living into the identity you've chosen for yourself. And that does seem
the
like
box
the
that you've
tragedy
decided to tick. Yeah.
Yeah, that really seems like a powerful conclusion. So the tragedy of this next generation that they're going to live through. But I didn't quite follow why it was the conclusion to the history you gave. So I just wanted to ask, like, you're sort of saying something changed here at some point, where, you know, this hasn't always been the relationship to authenticity. Like, what is this? At what point does this sort of horrible form of authenticity come in? Are you offering a kind of alternative to that? Like, how is this the problem we need to get out of? That you're like looking back into the. I mean, all the history is extremely new to me. But am I reading this right? You're looking back into this history of these discussions about authenticity and states to look for an alternative to this kind of tragic form of authenticity that seems dominant now, or what?
Yes, on some general level, of course. I do think I'm not a historian of thought or a historian of philosophy. I am interested in this specific history, yes, but I am interested in it because I think it does address a relevant concern. So this would be the short answer. So yes, I do find this question of authenticity or alienation as pertaining also very specifically for today. And I would even argue, and this is, I think, was suggested in your question, I would even argue that today we are perhaps even more under pressure of being authentic. You know, both on the bureaucratic level, you know, having to prove that you really are who you are, but also on the spiritual level, like, yes, but you are not your own bureaucracy. Obviously, you are not that. You're obviously beyond that, and that's your true self, and you have to really care about that. So, from both sides, this would be my point. We are, you know, kind of threatened to be authentic, or forced to be authentic.
Nicholas and then
Yeah, so thanks. Now I'm both Protestant and come from one of the most happiest countries in the world. So
they say.
But my question is a little bit different. I mean, what you pointed at, that you can't have either or here, that you just, you know, forget the state and society and forget authenticity as such. But I wonder, I mean, if you frame it rather in the terms of, because I agree with you, but if you frame it in terms of what it means to have social recognition or social affirmation, which is not only, I mean, the state is one historical way in which that function, that let's say distribution or economy of recognition. But it seems to me that, I mean, one thing is that in this sense, I think the social structures are quintessential for something which we can dub happiness or whatever you want to call it. Exactly in this sense that we, to the extent we have, let's say, rigid or some kind of limited forms of how we are given social recognition, that gives us space to be. I mean, so you can feel that, well, you know, whenever you, I don't know, you take up your profession of your father, and then, you know, you marry, okay, you've done your deed, you know, you get your recognition, you're basically a ready-made person in that sense. And you don't need to anymore, you know, kind of exceed or accelerate in how you're going to get that social recognition. It's limited in all kinds of ways, but that gives you, in a certain way, that doesn't give you happiness as such, but that gives you a certain kind of freedom, where something like then happiness or authenticity or whatever might. I'm not saying that former cultures or pre-modern or pre-postmodern cultures were better than what we have now, but what it seems to be now, the problem is exactly that we never get an efficient amount of social recognition. So nobody will ever put the hand on your shoulder and say, you know, okay, you know, you're fine. Let's take, you know, now you've done your thing. That's what we lack, I think.
But
and
is it something that we should be able to get through the state, or not?
I think that, well, the state, maybe.
The church?
But whatever, I mean, but social recognition as a form of collective management, or whatever you want to call it, or a distributor of that. And those structures need to be not hysterical like they are now. I mean, that would be my...
Thank you.
I think to follow what you're saying, we do seem to get that kind of recognition when we die. If you think of the way people speak at memorials and funerals, that is in fact exactly the time when they say, he lived this wonderful life and blah blah, you know, so unfortunately, ironically, that's what happened. So my question, Gregor, is it's really more a comment in dialogue with you. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about happiness. You said a lot about authenticity and alienation. I wonder if happiness is not another way of thinking about unalienation, right? The negative, the opposite of alienation.
Yeah.
If you look at the etymology of the word happy in English, from what I know, it has something to do with fit, right? To fit, when things fit, then it's the state of hap. So happiness has something to do with things fitting together. And so no wonder, you know, we all feel alienated, but because when do things always fit together, you know, for us? But listening to your talk, because both on the right and the left, communists, capitalists, they all come to this idea of whether the government should be responsible for our happiness. I think it's a very interesting question, right? And look at the American way, right? Happiness being written into the Constitution and all that. But, so my question is, why is that an issue? Why is happiness? I mean, and talk more about happiness to us. I mean, is that really a personal issue? Is there a collective issue? And I wonder if the happiness doesn't emerge from a certain, I would call, cultural tradition. Listening to you talk, I'm reminded of all the figures of unhappiness in, let's say, the German romantic tradition. If you think of homelessness, you know, everyone is so melancholic, homeless. And I'm even thinking of Georg Lukács, his theory of the novel, you remember. He said the novel is in fact about transcendental homelessness. So the figure of the homeless, I think, is very much part of a long tradition of thinking, maybe philosophical and literary. I wonder if we could turn it into like a kind of ethnographic thing, like why the homelessness and unhappiness emerge like that. I think in a very modern kind of way, you know. So these are all thoughts triggered by your talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much. These are great comments, and I think happiness does have a lot to do with how I designed, quote unquote, this talk. And I just wanted to say that in the way I see the whole problem of the pursuit of happiness is, you know, comes not actually from Jefferson, but from Locke, who I think uses it. But I'm not an expert on this. This is something that we have an expert on Locke here, so maybe he'll educate us. But the way I understand Locke is that pursuit of happiness is not something that the government should make sure that you can, but rather that pursuit of happiness is kind of like the efficient cause that makes humans go from the state of nature into the state of civil society. So it's kind of like something that causes government, but then what the purpose and what government does with that, we don't know. Whereas Jefferson turns it around, I think changes what the cause is and what the effect is, and then says, no, well, the only reason for government to do anything is to secure the pursuit of happiness. And so with the German perspective on happiness, I'll just be very brief and read this one beautiful quote from Nietzsche. Man does not strive for happiness. Only the Englishman does that. I think Nietzsche puts it the best.
But you know, there's another, the other famous Nietzsche quote, right? Happiness is the feeling of one's power increasing, of resistance being
Well, that's Spinoza, right?
No, this is Nietzsche.
Okay. All right, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, hi. Thanks again for such a fantastic talk. I wanted to begin with Professor Chow's comment on the authority or the authenticity only after death, which...
Oh yeah, of course, I wanted to comment on that too. Yes, please go ahead.
It's like when you think of Kojev, when he talks about the authority of the father, only after the death does it have this sort of like, now you must really obey the expectations, because now it's final, because
when
they're
the father
gone.
dies, right?
Correct, yeah. But I've got a question that I wrote down because it's all so many ideas going on, but you can address that if you'd like to first.
I just wanted to briefly mention that I think Hegel is all about that. I think Hegel's solution is your personal happiness matters less than the objective happiness that you are declared to in your death. So in the sense, like this is why death is important, because when in phenomenology he discusses Antigone and he discusses how Antigone has as a sister to bury her brother, like the whole point is that the family member needs to take care of the dead in order to claim that he was not just a natural matter, but rather as a being of spirit. And yes, so death is that which ultimately makes you a being of spirit, where you authentically, it sounds, it's laughable in a sense because we want to be happy in this life, but from the perspective of the spirit, it matters that you have objectively received your authenticity, your seal of approval. You are approved. You have been buried. You are now part. It is clear that you were always a part of the spirit.
So authenticity only comes with death, right?
In a sense, yes.
You're alienated, finally.
Forever.
Until you die.
Eternal alienation.
Well, this question kind of continues on that point, saying you doubt the possibility or even the actuality of authentic human practice. More or less correct?
I did doubt it, yes, but I shared wouldn't that be nice? I mean, I feel it would be nice.
Okay, well, I've got more, but I'll hand it off to someone else. There.
But yeah, I'll ask something. I think I can remember what I was going to say. It was actually in relation to what you were saying, Nicholas. I think it's a really interesting point, and it's something we've been discussing a lot about these transitional stages like marriage and how this relates to recognition and how, you can't have a flat our generation, but you can have a gender, for instance. But but it's interesting that this question of capitalism and how it gives recognition and how recognition can be satisfying and how constructive it can be and what role it plays. But in a sense, capitalism ascribes value recognition through money, for instance. But in a way we have to form ourselves and alienate ourselves in order to get the money. But is there something even worse now where we have whole generations of people not getting any value at all from the market? But yeah, I mean, what role do you think this recognition plays, and does it do something positive, and what sort of positive thing does it do on subjectivity in terms of feeling okay and happiness?
Yeah, feeling okay. Yeah, I think the question of recognition complicates the whole problem of authenticity, because ideally, of course, for authenticity, you wouldn't really need someone else to recognize you. Like, ideally, authenticity can be achieved alone in your own chamber, ideally, right? But in reality, I think we do need some sort of mirror of bureaucracy. We need to see that authenticity bureaucratized. We need to see it alienated in the external world. We need to see it externalized. And this is, this is where I was going to go with Hegel, that his term for alienation was actually Entäußerung, which has its history in the Protestant theology, of course. I completely recognize that. And this is the way I would want it to go. Like, if the only way to authenticity, if it means anything, is through the Entäußerung, is through the alienation into ultimately of God into Christ and coming back to Himself, but more practically, of human being, some sort of being of I don't know, potentialities into something actual in the world. So if we do want to have a kind of actualization, we do want to have a kind of Verwirklichung in the world, and that is only achievable as Entäußerung, as a kind of alienation.
Hi. I just wanted to say that the project itself is fascinating as it relates to life in Yugoslavia, because life in Yugoslavia was weird, right, in comparison. But the listening to you throughout, the only the thing that just kept coming back into my mind was Kovačević's Balkanski špijun, the Balkan Spy, right? Would you please tell me you've seen?
I'm not sure if recently, no.
Okay,
yeah, I would probably remember it from youth. Just go ahead.
No, but it's kind of significant, I suppose, because it illustrates, I think, the protagonist of this film, right, is like a completely deeply alienated subject, right? He's this kind of like family man whose son is like a complete piece of shit. His wife is a sort of housemaker, and he goes to the factory every day for like 40 years. And then it's inflation, life's bad, and then suddenly this guy comes in from abroad, and he's got all this money, and this sort of like honest Yugoslav working man immediately goes to DB and says like, there's this guy, I'm pretty sure he's like a spy, and they say, okay, don't do anything about it, which he of course interprets as like, stay on this guy's ass all the time. right? And I mean, I really don't want to spoil my luck.
Yeah, let's. I'll have to watch it again.
But yeah, the point that I'm trying to get at is, you know, within the context of Yugoslav life, there, at least in hindsight, you get plenty of people kind of reminiscing about, well, you know, there were all these mandated things, but of course it was understood as a joke, or it was always understood as like a suggestion that it was kind of intended for you to surpass. You say within, even in your talk, right, self-management was not taken seriously.
Not even by authorities.
Not even by authorities, precisely. But so, you know, so I suppose what I'm curious about is whether there was any accounting for this, I suppose, realpolitik kind of jovial aspect of implementation by the people at Praxis, or, and even on the other hand, if, I forget the guy's name now, Cardel and the authorities, obviously they would not have avowed this, but would have been aware of the kind of sort of functional dysfunction, if you will, of these implementations, and where that lies. Does that make any sense, or have I just garbled it?
I'm not sure if I'd have a good response, but thank you for the comments nevertheless. Sorry.
Is there time? Yeah. Okay. But are you going to respond for
we can talk later.
Yeah, sorry, I was a bit sick over the weekend, so maybe it's just my brains.
I tend to make these things worse.
My question's simple. It's about so the quotation, the slogan, or the, I guess it wasn't a slogan, just the quotation about the state not providing happiness, but it being so I just noticed that as you talked about that, though, you slipped into saying the state doesn't, like the state is indifferent to you, and then you can be indifferent to the state. But I guess my question would be, does it matter if it's, the state is indifferent to, it doesn't need to provide you happiness for you. That doesn't necessarily mean the state is indifferent to you. So the difference would be like between caring about you and caring about your happiness. So maybe the state's role is to provide, you know, what you need at a foundational level to reproduce your existence or regulate the social sphere, but then that's not a matter of happiness. So is there, yeah.
I agree, but I suppose I was cutting a longer argument short. I think because in a sense I would also argue that the state doesn't also, it's not just the happiness that the state is indifferent to, it's also to your unhappiness that the state is completely indifferent to. Or even for instance, your guilt. If you commit a crime and, you know, are processed by the authorities, it's usually just a bureaucratic routine. For you, it might be experience of guilt and so on, but for the state, it's just, okay, please, you know, this, I need to do this, tell me your name, you're in the name of the Father. I mean, it's just bureaucratic nonsense. The bureaucracy is by definition indifferent to your feelings of guilt or joy or happiness. And this can relate either to marriage or happy events or to death and unhappy events. Even though, of course, it's always nice when we see the priest or, you know, someone else crying at the wedding, or when we see the person who puts the urn into the grave crying. I mean, it's always nice. But it's not essentially required by the system itself. This is all I wanted to say. And in Yugoslavia, it was really very clear on the level of actual existence that the system is one thing, and how you live and, you know, your emotions about that is completely different. As these are two separate worlds.
Just one short last question.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Okay. So I'll be that guy who says this is more of a comment than a question. You know, at the time is probably the worst to say so. So
is it very long?
Okay, I'll try to keep it short and basically I'll skip some of this stuff. So basically, this is regarding Carde, and the colleague before me kind of also provided a good introduction to that. basically, he's usually depicted as this Yugoslav Mephisto of self-management. You know, whatever the system does, Kardelj is there to justify it and says this was planned all along. Yeah, but I think we would have done the same if we were like, you know, in his seat, basically. If you would make any sort of system and you still have all these like praxis school philosophers, you know, coming out and talking about happiness and alienation whatsoever, I think it was necessary to criticize them in the sense that basically there's something I'll be talking about tomorrow, by the way. Kardelj was actually sitting on top of a workers' education system that annually educated about 200,000 people, you know, and these praxis school philosophers, they had influence, you know, so I think and there was also this idea that, you know, while they did become rock stars and, you know, in academia and whatnot, I think they sometimes really went overboard, and also some of the archival evidence I'll be presenting tomorrow will tackle this, but just, you know, briefly, I discovered recently, actually a friend of mine, something called kafana mrak. I don't know if you know this, but this is just a short anecdote. So in Ljubljana, there was this kafana mrak. It's called kafana darkness, and basically in 1986, a lot of praxis school philosophers did actually gather to discuss like destroying Yugoslavia and introducing a market-based system. They were discussing like Thatcher and Reaganism, a bit of alienation, you know, is there. There's like a police transcript of 191 pages that, you know, like it also involves Heideggerians like Tina Hribar and Spomenka. This is of course a bit controversial because they're still alive, and so, you know, like I think it was not just this theoretical back and forth of alienation, you know, but I think there was also a political conflict by that time in the 1980s. And I mean, I'm not sure what Slavoj, some, you know, these Ljubljana school people think about it, but my hunch is that this might have played a role. Okay, so I skipped all the questions.
Yeah, so as a man, I know that the man's got to do what he has to do, so the final word is always by a woman. So, Bara, be quick.
I'll be very quick. I'll just also add a comment to Alexander. Yeah, I would also say that yeah, the self. I wouldn't agree that self-management was like only taken like as a joke for everyone here. I would say that this was a super serious project and a super serious endeavor. And I would also say that as far as I was studying Yugoslavia, I think this was an experiment, a social experiment of great extent and very specific, totally different from the Soviet and totally different from the other Eastern countries. It had 4 constitutions, 46, 53, 63 and 74, and in each constitution they changed the system, and the idea was that they are coming closer and closer to Marx's realization of, like, so the final stage from socialism would be Marxism, communism, sorry. So this was my comment, yeah.
Yes, I think I should comment on this comment to say that yes, of course, I shared that view completely. Like, of course, it was a serious project. Of course, it was meant seriously in the sense that we are searching self-management. This was a serious project. But I am also saying that on the practical level, on the bureaucratic level, it did not fulfill those expectations, its own expectations. Yeah. That's all I'm saying. And so on the practical level, you know, the self-management was just bureaucracy, was just people in the end deciding something and then the others said that they agree. I mean, this is how it actually turned out to be in the 80s.
But it was also the thing of the property. People really owned the companies. This is also very important.
Yeah, did they though?
Yeah.
It's you know, self-management was about means of production. That's the main point. So, but your final words are really interesting, but it won't, you know, is this the definition of happiness? You know?
I don't
realizing own expectations.
right. They did not realize their own expectations. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's late. Thank you, Gregor.